Usually when we talk about gratitude, we are operating under this unspoken expectation of a transaction, like keeping a mental ledger right.
Right, exactly. Someone holds the door open for you at the coffee shop and you say thank you.
Yeah. Or a friend spots you for lunch because you forgot your wallet and you make sure to pick up the tab the next time you go out. The whole system is just incredibly balanced.
It's neat and it's socially comfortable.
And most importantly, the debt is clearly defined and very easily settled.
The parameters of that kind of everyday gratitude are contained. You know exactly what you owe, and you know exactly how to pay it back. And once you do, the psychological books are closed.
Right, you can go back to your day without carrying any lingering weight.
But then you step into the world of intense mid-20th century theology. Specifically, we're looking at a speech and prayer delivered by Reverend Sun Myung Moon on December 23rd, 1956.
Titled The Living Altar of Gratitude and Victory. And when you open a historical document like this, suddenly that neat little social ledger is just completely thrown out the window.
Oh, absolutely thrown out the window. Today, we are looking strictly at the architecture of this specific text.
And just a quick reminder for you listening, we are doing this not to endorse it or to take any theological sides here. We just want to impartially dissect the raw, intense mechanics of its worldview.
Because in this text, gratitude isn't a polite nod. It is a literal cosmic draft notice. It completely redefines what it means to owe something to someone else.
It really does. Okay, let's unpack this.
Okay.
To understand how someone can willingly sign up for a cosmic war, which is exactly where this text takes us, you have to look at what they are running away from.
Right, the text doesn't start with a battle cry. It starts with a diagnosis of absolute terror. It paints a picture of humanity's default state that is viscerally bleak.
Viscerally bleak is a great way to put it, because the phrasing used to describe humanity before intervention is, it's incredibly terminal.
It really is. It doesn't portray people as just making a few mistakes or wandering off a moral path. It describes humanity as a people living in an earth of darkness.
An earth of darkness. Wow.
Yeah, and the text says they're enduring suffering indignation without a single day where the moans of death ever end.
The moans of death. That is such an aggressively haunting phrase. You don't read that and think of...
Mild dissatisfaction.
Right, exactly. You think of absolute unrelenting agony.
And the language gets even more physical, almost suffocating.
Yeah.
The prayer talks about bodies having been literally submerged in death and submerged in darkness.
And when you are submerged, you are surrounded on all sides.
Exactly. There is no air. There is no light. It is an environment of total sensory and spiritual deprivation. The logic of the text relies entirely on establishing that terror.
It ensures the believer feels the full crushing weight of their own default hopelessness. So to understand the mechanism of the theology here, we have to look at the pivot.
The pivot is massive. The text violently contrasts that static, suffocating despair with its concept of salvation.
Suddenly, these drowning believers are connected to what the speaker calls the pulse of love of our universal Father.
Yeah.
I love the sensory shift there. You go from being pinned down under the water, completely immobilized by darkness, to suddenly feeling a heartbeat.
A dynamic, rhythmic pulse of love. The text says their bodies are suddenly submerged in a flow of life which had been hidden in heaven.
That contrast is the catalyst for everything that follows.
It is. But the text also adds an immense layer of historical guilt and scale to this rescue. It points out that this sudden flow of life wasn't just a spontaneous act of kindness.
Right, it specifically mentions the grace of the Trinity, which has toiled consistently while passing through thousands of years of history.
So the salvation is framed as the ultimate culmination of millennia of agonizing divine labor. God has been working for thousands of years just to get to the point where he could pull you out of the water.
Which completely changes the nature of the rescue. I mean, it is less like a lifeguard pulling you from a local swimming pool and more like being rescued from drowning by a military general who hauls you onto a battleship.
That is a perfect analogy. You aren't just saved from the dark water. You are instantly conscripted.
Right. The relief of surviving is immediately hijacked by the sheer scale of what it took to save you and the obligation to man the cannons. Which makes me wonder about the psychological trap of this doctrine.
How so?
Well, does this intense framing of absolute unending darkness make the light of brightness feel more like a desperate, terrified necessity for survival rather than a freely given gift?
That terror is intentionally structural, I would say. The visceral relief from the moans of death, combined with the knowledge of that thousand-year divine effort, is the fuel.
It creates a debt so massive that everyday transactional gratitude just shatters.
Exactly. You can't just say thank you to a divine force that spent millennia orchestrating your escape from eternal suffocation.
Because once you realize you are dead and now you are alive, the natural progression of the text asks the impossible question. How do you possibly respond to that?
Which brings us to the central paradox of the entire source material. The text explicitly states the impossible reality of the situation right up front.
It says, quote, "There is no way to repay your grace, even if we give you all our minds and bodies."
Right? It acknowledges that the ledger can never, ever be balanced. The math of salvation simply does not work in the human's favor.
Yet, in the very next breath, despite acknowledging the mathematical impossibility of the debt, the speaker pleads to do exactly that.
They ask God to allow them to become living offerings who give their minds and bodies entirely to the work. They are essentially volunteering to be consumed.
Here's where it gets really interesting to me, because it isn't just about giving up your time or your resources. They are actively praying for a state of psychological inadequacy.
The phrasing is incredibly specific there. The speaker asks God
To allow us to become people who feel our insufficiency of our own accord.
yes.
And to feel overwhelmed of our own accord. I mean, they are asking for pity and pardon because they haven't been able to offer themselves as living offerings up until now today.
Think about the mechanics of that kind of prayer. You are asking the divine to ensure that you never feel like you've done enough.
Right, you are asking to be permanently stripped of any sense of accomplishment or spiritual security.
It sounds a bit like modern hustle culture or extreme imposter syndrome, but dialed up to a cosmic eternal scale.
It really does. If you know you can never repay the debt and you are literally praying to feel overwhelmed and insufficient on purpose, doesn't that create a permanent state of spiritual anxiety?
Like you're running on a treadmill that is slowly speeding up and the control panel is locked.
Exactly. Or is it possible that within the logic of this text, it is meant to be a strangely freeing surrender? Because if the pressure to actually fully repay the debt is fundamentally off the table, maybe admitting your own uselessness is the only way to find peace.
That is a fascinating way to look at it. Exploring how this actually functions for the believer reveals that the insufficiency itself is the tool of transformation.
So the stated desire isn't just to torture the believer with anxiety for the sake of suffering.
No, not at all. By completely emptying themselves of ego, by constantly admitting total inadequacy, they create a human void. They become a blank slate.
The paradox is that only by recognizing you are hopelessly insufficient can you become pure enough to be used by the divine.
Exactly. The ultimate goal is to eventually become an offering that God can be proud of eternally, an offering that God can rejoice over and be pleased by.
So the psychological breaking point is the requirement. You have to empty out the self so that the divine has a clean vessel to operate through.
But this personal surrender, this agonizing process of becoming a living offering, it isn't just for the individual's own spiritual peace or their private relationship with God.
Right. This is where the text suddenly zooms out and the scale of the document shifts dramatically. We go from the deep internal psychology of the believer straight onto a global, even cosmic stage.
The theology extends from a rescue mission to a theater of war. The text reveals that this emptied-out individual, this offering, is actually required ammunition.
The prayer states that God is requesting this people to become an offering of victory, and the reason given is incredibly stark.
Yes, in order to block this people from being swept away by the waves of death.
Let's break down the strategic operational language used in this part of the prayer because it completely subverts the idea of peaceful worship.
It really does. These living offerings are explicitly drafted for combat. They are required to settle accounts on the battlefield of good and evil.
Settle accounts, that is not the language of a passive congregation. That sounds like a targeted military strike.
They are acting as the vanguard. The text says they must resolve the sites of your work. But the absolute pinnacle of this mobilization is something even more surprising.
Yeah, the most striking theological inversion in the entire document is where the speaker says they must be offerings able to take responsibility for all areas that you are worried about, Father.
That line is just wild.
It stopped me in my tracks. The idea of a human taking responsibility for the worries of God. In almost every conventional religious framework, the dynamic flows the other way.
Right, the human is small, weak, and anxious, and they bring their earthly worries to the omnipotent divine for comfort and resolution.
But here the text flips the script entirely. The human is stepping up to shoulder the divine burdens.
God is positioned as a general who is worried about the state of the cosmic map, and the human soldier is saying, "Don't worry, I will hold this line for you."
It assigns an unimaginable level of importance to the individual believer. You are no longer just a rescued victim. You are a load-bearing pillar of the universe.
And the ultimate endgame of this battlefield mobilization, the reason they are taking on God's worries is to establish what the text calls an altar of victory.
And when the text talks about establishing an altar of victory to subjugate Satan, it clearly isn't talking about building a physical table out of wood and stone in a church building somewhere.
No, in this framework, the altar is that psychological void we talked about earlier. By completely emptying themselves of ego, by becoming living offerings, they create a staging ground.
The human mind and body become the literal foothold that the divine uses to push back against the darkness.
And the purpose of subjugating Satan and holding back those waves of death isn't just about defeating an enemy. Through this victory, the text hopes that a beacon of love and compassion will finally appear to the rest of humanity.
It specifically calls out the pitiful sons and daughters who do not know the age and the time.
The ignorant,
Yeah.
the people who are still submerged in the dark water and don't even realize a rescue boat is out there.
So what does this all mean for you, the listener, who is trying to understand this mindset? It basically amounts to spiritual geopolitics,
And
right?
it really does.
The believers who have already been saved aren't allowed to just sit comfortably on the sidelines, wrapping themselves in a towel and sipping warm broth. They are handed a rifle and sent right back into the freezing water to protect the others.
Which brings us back to that massive debt of gratitude.
Right. So they are saved but immediately drafted to hold back the waves of death. Is their gratitude effectively being weaponized as a call to arms?
That is exactly what is happening. The weaponization of gratitude is the engine of this entire theological movement.
Wow.
It takes the modern, often self-centered concept of gratitude, which we usually use to find our own inner peace, and turns it into an aggressive tool for cosmic mobilization.
So you are not allowed to use your gratitude to feel comfortable. You must use it to fight.
But to understand how a human being could possibly endure that level of pressure, carrying God's worries, fighting an eternal enemy feeling permanently insufficient, we have to look at the resolution. The text doesn't end on the battlefield.
Right. If they are acting as the vanguard in this cosmic war, the end game can't just be fighting forever. The psychological toll of being a living offering would eventually destroy the person.
Absolutely. The text has to offer some kind of armistice or some ultimate reward for carrying the weight of the divine. And the final hope expressed in the prayer provides that exact release.
Because after all the militaristic language of settling accounts and subjugating Satan, the tone shifts drastically in the closing lines, doesn't it?
It does. The ultimate goal is to return glory and joy as unified beings by being quickly embraced in your bosom of love, which wants to embrace us.
So the weaponized gratitude, the endless feeling of inadequacy, the brutal conditions of the cosmic battlefield, it all points toward an ultimate, intimate reconciliation.
The soldier doesn't fight just for the sake of fighting. They fight to finally drop their weapons, go home, and be held.
The bosom of love represents the closing of the ledger. It is the only place where the infinite debt is finally absorbed, not by the human paying it off, but by the divine erasing the distance between them.
The human and the divine become unified beings.
When you step back and look at the whole architecture of this 1956 prayer, the psychological journey it demands of a believer is staggering.
Truly staggering.
You start in the absolute terror of drowning in the moans of death, completely submerged in darkness. Then you are violently pulled into the light by a divine force that has been working for millennia to reach you.
And your response to that rescue is this agonizing, paradoxical desire to feel permanently inadequate.
You volunteer to become a living offering, emptying yourself out entirely just so you can stand on the front line of a spiritual war and shoulder the worries of God himself.
All of it, every ounce of that suffering and duty, driven by the hope of one day being embraced as a unified being.
Examining historical primary sources like this gives us a raw, unfiltered look at how extreme devotion and spiritual duty were articulated in a specific moment in time.
It forces us to engage with concepts of sacrifice, duty, and spiritual obligation that are entirely foreign to how most people operate today. You simply cannot grasp the intensity of this belief system from a detached summary.
No, you really have to wade into the text and feel the weight of the words they are using. And that brings us to a final thought we want to leave you with today. Something to mull over on your own as you step back into that normal, socially comfortable transactional world we started talking about.
The text ultimately looks forward to returning glory and joy as unified beings after the war is won and Satan is subjugated. That is the grand light at the end of the tunnel, the great embrace.
But think about the strict stated requirements to reach that final state. If total self-sacrifice, feeling perpetually insufficient, and permanently giving up your own mind and body are the mandatory steps to get there, how does an individual actually maintain their own identity?
That is the big question.
If you have perfectly emptied yourself of ego to become a living offering who is actually left to be embraced at the end of the war, can you be a unified being if you no longer exist?
Or in this intense theological framework is the complete erasure of the individual self. Not a tragedy at all, but the actual true definition of victory.
A profound contradiction to walk away with. Does the soldier survive the war, or does only the victory remain?
Exactly.
Thank you so much for joining us for this deep dive into the architecture of extreme devotion. Next time someone holds the door for you, maybe just say thank you and appreciate the absolute luxury of a ledger that is settled right there on the spot. We will see you next time.